They stand at the edge of a warming world that reorganizes itself as the ice retreats, and the story opens not with fields, but with water, stone, and wind. The last glacial maximum has passed. Now, between roughly 19,000 and 11,700 years before the present, the planet enters a long exhale. Great ice sheets that once pressed into North America and northern Europe, thin and collapsed rivers pour outward with a violence that leaves quiet traces. Braided channels, terraces, deltas, and shorelines creep inland as seas begin their slow rise. In the Near East, steppe and open woodland replace colder scrub, and in spring the hills carry bands of green where wild barley and einkorn take hold. People move with the seasons as they always do, reading the landscape's cues, the meltwater routes, the returning game, the ripening seed heads. They camp near upland meadows as snow withdraws and descend to valleys when heat sets in, returning to the same ground often enough that paths harden and middens grow. This section rests on a consensus fact that frames everything to come with the end of the Younger Dryas. Around 11,700 years ago, the Holocene begins bringing generally warmer and more stable climates than the millennia before, even as regional variability continues. The planetary engine shifts gear. Atmospheric carbon dioxide has already climbed from the glacial lows near 190 parts per million toward levels around 260 to 270, and that rise paced by oceans and feedbacks feeds thicker forests, stronger monsoons, and more predictable growing seasons. The change is not a switch, but a threshold crossed in fits and starts, and human groups feel it in pragmatic ways. The returning abundance of fish in thawed rivers, the longer persistence of edible seeds on stalks, the reappearance of perennial springs that make a campsite last through the dry months. Lesser known yet telling are residues and siliceous polish found on grinding stones and flint blades in late Epipaleolithic sites of the Levant, including the Jordan Valley and the Hula Basin, where starch grains of wild cereals adhere to tools used long before domestication is fixed. These traces show that people routinely process gathered grains, pounding and grinding them into meals that store well and cook quickly. They also point to an emerging relationship when families gather and grind in the same sheltered hollows year after year. The ground itself begins to organize their time, where husks pile, where fires sit, where seeds dry on woven mats held down with stones. Yet a mystery still shadows the path from gathering to planting. Is it climate stabilization, after the abrupt chill of the Younger Dryas, that encourages more intensive use of cereals, or do social pressures, communal feasts, ritual obligations, the appeal of reliable grain-based foods play the decisive role? The debate remains open because both forces leave similar signatures in the earth, and the record is partial. Across the wider planet, the scale of change is continental. As ice retreats, sea level begins a rise that will eventually total over 100 meters from glacial lows, redrawing coasts from Sunda Shelf to the Atlantic margins. Islands knit and then separate, estuaries swallow floodplains, and ancient river mouths drown far offshore. Isostatic rebound lifts previously burdened lands in the far north, even as deltas load and sink elsewhere. Winds shift. Where once dust blew thick from parched basins, now grasses and shrubs take root and anchor soils. In the Near East, the spring rains come a little more reliably, and the summer dry season lengthens enough to stress some plants and favor others. Human movement matches these rhythms. They track gazelle along ecotones and follow wild boar and onager toward reed beds and oak patches. They pause at limestone springs and cave mouths, whose shade and acoustics make good camps. Firelight returns to the same stones. Char builds under hearths that see hundreds of meals. Natufian hamlets gather in parts of the Levant. Even before full farming, their semicircular stone houses roofed with brush, their cemeteries nestled behind walls. Sickle blades with gloss from repeated cutting hint at harvests of wild stands that sway just beyond the door. Hearth smoke carries the smell of ground grain baked on hot slabs, while flat river stones serve as querns, the upper handstone fitting neatly into palms that grow calloused from the rocking motion. If a seed head shatters too readily, it scatters. If it holds more seeds, can be collected, and that simple difference, shattering versus non-shattering, will later mark the genetic shift to domesticated forms. Yet here at the beginning, both kinds mingle in patches where people concentrate their picking. A detail from one valley speaks to larger patterns. Charred spikelets recovered from early sites show that people sometimes collected green, semi-ripe cereals to parch and store, a strategy that reduces losses to birds and shattering, and that spreads labor across weeks rather than days. This is knowledge born of patient watching, of noticing how different slopes ripen in a staggered sequence, and how a clouded week can delay a seed head's readiness. The planetary observation holds steady in the background. As northern summers receive more solar energy due to orbital configurations, seasonality relaxes compared with the depths of the glacial age. Forests edge northward, and in Southwest Asia, the patchwork of plant communities becomes more complex, offering more niches for human subsistence. Still, predictability is relative. A spring can fail, a river can cut a new channel, a warm decade can be followed by years of surprise frost. People hedge against this by diversifying. They gather acorns and pistachios, trapfish where streams pinch, and cache dried seeds in pits sealed with clay and stone. They also begin to move things as well as themselves. Obsidian, from Anatolian sources, shows up far from its quarries, carried in slung bags, along routes that may also carry stories, spouses, and ideas. Shell beads, cut and drilled near distant coasts, lie in inland burials, a quiet measure of exchange networks that link valleys to seas. In this wider weaving, the first prerequisites of farming take shape without fields: familiarity with plant life cycles, seasonal return to favored patches, storage that stretches a harvest across hunger seasons, and a social calendar that gathers hands at the right moment to strip seeds by the basket. The scale of their world is intimate and vast at once, a day's walk to a known spring, a yearly range that loops longer than the distance between modern capitals, and a lifetime that sees a river's terrace climb a meter as silt accumulates beneath the same hearth. No one calls this farming. There are no furrows cut with wood ard or irrigation channels scoring the ground. But after the ice retreats, the land steadies enough to reward repeated attention, and attention brings pattern. Patterns bring expectations, and expectations change decisions: where to sleep, what to risk, which seeds to keep close. In the quiet intervals between migrations, in the shade of oak and terebinth, people tend small clearings near camp, pull weeds around convenient stands, knock seed heads into baskets, and scatter some rachises where ash keeps the soil open. The step from that habit to intentional sowing is smaller than it seems. Yet they still live by many foods in many places, a diversified present held within an increasingly legible year. The section closes with the unresolved question, still intact. Did climate's new stability pull them toward routine, or did their social worlds push them toward it? Either way, after the ice retreats, the stage is set. Landscapes offer repetition without sameness, and human groups anchored by storage and return stand close to the line that later generations will cross into fields. The Fertile Crescent emerges as a band of land stretching from the Levant through northern Mesopotamia and into the foothills of the Zagros, where rainfall is sufficient for grasslands to flourish without irrigation, and where the variety of microclimates provides both security and experimentation. Here in the early Holocene, the change from cold steppe to a patchwork of oak, pistachio, and grass meadows creates a landscape in which wild wheat, barley, and lentils grow thick in patches. People return to these areas guided by memory of abundance, and they find that the cycles of growth repeat with enough regularity to become dependable. This region holds a scientific fact that anchors the narrative genetic studies of modern crops, trace their origin to wild progenitors in these very foothills, showing that the Fertile Crescent is not a metaphor, but a true cradle of domestication, where einkorn and emmer wheat along with barley and pulses first transform under human hands. In the upland valleys of what is today southeastern Turkey, sites like Karakadog preserve the closest relatives of domesticated wheat, and this genetic continuity reveals a story that cannot be told from tools alone. The plants themselves remember where they were first gathered, first sown, and first selected. Yet the process begins long before farming. Hunter-gatherer groups, sometimes called Natufians in the Levant, begin building semi-sedentary hamlets of stone and brush positioned near natural stands of cereals. Archaeological remains show these villages were not mere seasonal encampments, but places with hearths grinding stones, storage pits and burials, signs of permanence, even while hunting and foraging still provide much of the food. A lesser-known detail comes from one of these sites within the early structures at Jericho. The plastered floors sometimes contain impressions of reeds and seeds, traces left when building material was mixed with the very plants growing just outside the walls. The houses themselves become archives of the surrounding ecology sealed in lime. Still, the turning of grain into farming is not inevitable. The mystery remains why people in this fertile land, rich with wild resources, chose to intensify their reliance on a handful of species. One line of thought suggests that abundance created new social dynamics, feasts, ceremonies, and gatherings that demanded surplus food, which in turn encouraged more deliberate tending of wild stands. Another view emphasizes stress. Sudden dry spells and cold snaps may have made predictable harvests more valuable than abundant but unreliable wild foods. Both forces likely intertwine, but the archaeological record does not yet allow a definitive answer. The planetary scale of this shift is broadening. As the Holocene stabilizes, monsoon belts strengthen, and deserts briefly retreat. The Sahara, still green with lakes and savannas, supports populations who fish, herd, and gather. In South Asia, summer rains feed wild stands of rice, while in East Asia, millet and rice await their own trajectories toward domestication. Yet it is in the Fertile Crescent that cereals first move firmly toward agriculture, not in isolation, but within a web of global climatic and ecological reorganization. Human hands act on landscapes in subtle but lasting ways. Paths carved by repeated return trample certain plants and encourage others. Controlled burns open meadows and release nutrients favoring grasses over shrubs. Stone walls built for dwellings alter drainage, and soon small plots of disturbed soil host denser stands of the very cereals people prefer. In this mosaic of disturbance and regeneration, cultivation becomes a matter of degrees, not sudden invention. The evidence of grinding stones adds weight to this picture. Their heavy presence in Natufian sites shows that grain processing is a regular activity long before fields are sown. Women, men, and children labor over querns, their repetitive motion leaving polish on tools and grooves in stone, but also grooves in bone. Skeletal remains show changes in joint stress, marking the bodily cost of early grain use. Alongside these are stone sickles, their flint edges glossed from cutting stalks, proof of harvests gathered systematically from wild patches. Storage pits appear lined with clay and stone, capable of holding reserves through lean seasons. These features suggest not only subsistence, but a new relationship with time. A seed can be kept, a surplus can be carried into another year, and in this continuity lies the foundation for deliberate cultivation. The lesser-known presence of legumes in these contexts expands the picture. Lentils, peas, and chickpeas are gathered and later domesticated alongside cereals, and they provide protein to balance the starchy diet. Archaeobotanical remains show that legumes are sometimes parched and stored in bulk, suggesting a dietary strategy more sophisticated than grain alone. This complexity reminds us that farming was never a single discovery, but a suite of practices woven together. Yet unresolved questions remain, especially about domestication speed. Was it a rapid transformation with visible genetic changes within a few centuries, or a slow process stretched over millennia? Charred grains from early Holocene sites show intermediate forms, neither fully wild nor fully domesticated, suggesting that domestication was gradual, but whether this reflects deliberate selection or unconscious gathering of favorable traits is still debated. The planetary observation that contextualizes all this is the broader rise in atmospheric stability. Climate records from ice cores and lake sediments show that variability diminishes compared with glacial times, offering windows of predictability long enough for human habit to align with plant cycles. Rivers settle into courses that persist for generations, soils accumulate in valleys, and the crescent-shaped arc of land becomes a corridor where ecological richness and human attention converge. Within this arc, people begin to create places of memory. Cemeteries appear near villages, linking the living with the dead in locations that endure. Shrines like those at Göbekli Tepe rise massive stone enclosures decorated with animals, suggesting that spiritual life flourishes at the same moment as food systems intensify. Some archaeologists propose that the demand to feed large gatherings at such ceremonial centers may have spurred greater reliance on cereals, an interpretation that, while debated, points again to the intertwining of social and subsistence needs. As people gather more often in larger numbers, food must be stored, and stored food creates both security and risk. Rodents threaten caches, requiring new strategies of protection. Clay bins, woven baskets sealed with bitumen, and underground silos show ingenuity directed toward a single aim, making abundance last. The grain itself, once eaten quickly, now waits through seasons, and with that waiting comes the possibility of planting. By scattering seed near settlements, whether intentionally or as discarded chaff, people begin to notice patterns. Some patches produce denser growth, some soils yield better, and some seed heads are easier to harvest. These observations accumulate, and across centuries they become practices that once widespread define farming. The scale reference is simple but powerful. The Fertile Crescent covers a span longer than the distance from Rome to Cairo. Yet within this arc, dozens of small groups, each with their own strategies, contribute to a shared transformation that changes not only their region, but the future trajectory of humanity. In these hills and plains, the awakening of a green crescent signals more than fertility of soil. It marks the threshold where foragers become cultivators and where landscapes begin to answer to human design as much as to seasonal rain. The story narrows now to the scale of camps among the wild wheat, where people who still live as hunter-gatherers begin to return again and again to favored locations. In the uplands of the Levant and the river valleys that thread through the Fertile Crescent, grasses grow dense and tall each spring, and with them come families who gather in numbers greater than before. The archaeological record preserves this rhythm. Natufian hamlets in the Levant, some occupied for centuries, show houses built of stone foundations, circular or semicircular, roofed with reeds and brush. Inside lie hearths, grinding stones, and storage pits, all arranged in ways that suggest repeated use by generations who returned seasonally but stayed long enough to establish patterns of community. This is the fact that anchors this section by around 14,000 years ago, before the appearance of true agriculture. Human groups in the Levant were already semi-sedentary, living in villages with permanent architecture while still relying on foraging. The continuity of occupation demonstrates that they had found landscapes rich enough and predictable enough to sustain repeated gathering of the same plants year after year. The image of camps among the wild wheat is supported by tangible detail: flint sickle blades with gloss from harvesting grasses, mortars and pestles worn smooth by pounding seeds, and pits dug carefully into bedrock to hold caches of nuts and cereals. These objects are not scattered randomly, but clustered in domestic contexts, testifying to households that manage food through planning and storage. Lesser known but striking is the discovery of human burials beneath house floors in these Natufian settlements, sometimes accompanied by shell beads or animal teeth. Such burials suggest not only attachment to place, but a symbolic claim binding the living community to a specific ground. The dead remain within the walls, and the walls anchor the return of the living. This integration of home memory and food production represents a profound shift in how space is valued. The unresolved mystery at the heart of these settlements is why this semi-sedentary life emerged here first when similar wild cereals grew in other regions. Some scholars suggest that the unique density of resources in the Levant allowed for larger, more permanent communities, while others argue that cultural or social innovations, perhaps new forms of ritual or kinship, encouraged groups to remain in one place. The debate continues, for the material record preserves evidence of permanence, but not the motivations behind it. Still, the scale of planetary change provides context, as the Younger Dryas looms around 12 to 900 years ago. Climates swing back toward cold and aridity, pressing communities to depend more heavily on predictable patches of cereals, and perhaps locking them further into patterns of return and storage. Across the wider world, similar experiments in semi-sedentism appear in other fertile river valleys, such as those along the Nile and in East Asia. But the Levant provides the clearest evidence that architecture, burial, and storage converge well before agriculture. The planetary observation here is that these human choices are embedded within a global reshaping. Sea levels continue to rise, forests advance into what were once cold steppes, and monsoon belts shift northward. Lakes swell in some basins and dry in others. These broad movements constrain and enable the choices of local communities, so that a village floor cut into limestone is not only a human decision, but also a response to planetary cycles that stabilize and destabilize in rhythm. The camps among the wild wheat are more than places of subsistence. They are stages for new social forms. Archaeological excavations reveal grinding stones so large they must have served entire households or neighborhoods, perhaps set into communal spaces. In some settlements, such as Ain Malaha in the Hula Basin, structures are large enough to suggest gathering places, and hearths are broad, suitable for feasting. The presence of dog burials in these same contexts reveals another layer. The domestication of animals begins to entwine with the semi-sedentary life, binding humans and animals together in enduring relationships centered on shared settlements. A lesser-known but telling piece of evidence comes from residues of wild barley and oats on stone tools, showing that a variety of cereals were processed, not just the ones that later became dominant domesticates. This breadth of use indicates experimentation and flexibility, qualities that mark a transitional stage. It is not yet farming, but it is more than foraging. Storage pits offer another window. Some are lined with stone, some plastered with lime, others simply dug into soil. Their presence within houses suggests household-level planning, but their occurrence in communal spaces points toward shared strategies. Grain, once ephemeral, now lasts into lean months, and the act of storage changes social relations. Who controls the pit? Who distributes the contents? These questions are not answered in the record, but the architectural placement of storage hints that both household autonomy and communal sharing played roles. Mystery deepens with the symbolic dimension. At the site of Hilazon Taktit, a woman's burial includes not only shell beads but also parts of animals, tortoises, cattle, and even wild boar, interpreted as remnants of a ritual feast. Such finds suggest that the semi-sedentary life nurtures ceremonial traditions in which food, death, and community are inseparable. It is possible that feasting itself, with its demand for surplus, propelled further investment in cereals. On a planetary scale, this moment can be visualized as an arc of settlements stretching hundreds of kilometers across the Levant, each a node in a web of human occupation tied to wild cereals. The density of sites suggests population growth likely supported by more reliable food strategies. Genetic studies of human remains from these contexts reveal continuity with earlier hunter-gatherers, but also subtle shifts hinting at demographic growth and possibly at movements of people along exchange routes. Stone and shell artifacts confirm that networks spanned distances greater than 200 kilometers, longer than the journey from modern Damascus to Amman. These distances traversed regularly knit together communities that shared knowledge about harvesting, storage, and architecture. In such camps, the rhythm of life follows the plants. Spring brings the green shoots, summer ripens the heads, autumn provides nuts and pulses, and winter demands stored foods. The return of each season to the same place imprints expectation into memory, and with it, the seeds of cultivation. The choice to settle among wild wheat is not simply practical, it is ecological and temporal, aligning human life with the cycles of grasses. The permanence of houses, the presence of burials, the use of storage pits, all these mark a threshold. They are not yet farmers, but they live in landscapes where farming becomes thinkable, and their daily acts prepare the ground for the coming transformation. The camps among the wild wheat are both endings and beginnings. The end of a purely nomadic rhythm, the beginning of settled life, and the slow turning of attention from what the land gives to what it can be made to give. The shift from gathering to sowing begins quietly, almost invisibly, when seeds scattered by human hands take root near the edges of camps. Chaff and rachises discarded after threshing fall into soil disturbed by footsteps, fires, or construction. Some sprout, growing in unusually dense patches close to where people live. Observant families begin to notice that familiar grasses appear where none grew before, and that the convenience of harvesting them nearby reduces the need for long journeys to distant stands. The fact that grounds this section is straightforward yet profound archaeobotanical studies at early Holocene sites, such as Abu Huraira and Jerf el Ahmar in the Euphrates Valley, show the presence of domestication traits in cereals, non-shattering ears, and larger grains dating back more than 11,000 years, indicating that human interaction with plants directly influenced their genetic evolution. These changes cannot be explained by climate alone. They reflect sustained harvesting, resowing, and unintentional selection driven by human choices. The lesser-known details emerge in micro-remains impressions of cereal grains in clay traces left on plaster floors, and vessels reveal that seeds were not only processed but also handled during building and storage. When those impressions preserve domesticated features, they testify that people were living literally upon the evidence of their own agricultural experiments. Another subtle detail is the discovery of hoe-like digging sticks and groundstone tools shaped for soil working, suggesting that patches were sometimes cleared, scratched, or tended in ways beyond simple gathering. The unresolved mystery lies in intention. Did people recognize that scattering seeds would yield a future harvest, or did cultivation emerge through habit and accident reinforced over centuries until it became tradition? Some scholars argue for conscious planting motivated by the desire for security. Others emphasize unconscious selection with domestication emerging as a byproduct of human settlement. The truth may lie between these positions, but the uncertainty highlights how fragile the line is between gathering and farming. On a planetary scale, the context for this shift is the Holocene's relative stability compared with the glacial oscillations of the past. Climatic reconstructions from Greenland ice cores show that temperature fluctuations diminish in amplitude after 11,700 years ago, allowing predictable seasonal cycles that plants and humans alike could depend upon. Rivers carved stable channels, soils accumulated fertility, and growing seasons lengthened. This planetary consistency gave human actions a cumulative weight they had not carried before. Scattering seeds in a stable climate led not to loss but to repetition, and repetition is what anchors domestication. In the river valleys of the northern Fertile Crescent, the first fields of grain were not fields as we imagine them, but small, disturbed plots beside houses near hearths or on terraces above rivers. Archaeological traces show patches where seeds germinated in unnatural densities, sometimes dominated by a single species, evidence of resowing and selective harvesting. The presence of post holes and small enclosures suggests that people protected these patches from grazing animals, another sign that tending had crossed into cultivation. Lesser-known evidence of early cultivation comes from phytolith studies, microscopic silica bodies preserved in soils that show cereal management at sites where no visible macro remains survive. These studies reveal that people were creating niches for grasses earlier and more widely than charred grains alone suggest. They were unintentionally gardening the edges of their settlements. Storage and scattering are inseparable in this stage. When families emptied pits of grain for grinding and cooking, spilled seeds could germinate. When they discarded husks into middens, some survived to sprout. Over time, people noticed which patches returned the next season and may have begun to encourage them. The repetition of such acts over centuries shaped both the plants and the people who depended on them. Mystery deepens when we consider that domesticated traits do not appear uniformly. In some valleys, grains with domesticated features appear early. In others, wild types dominate for millennia. Why certain communities crossed the threshold sooner remains unclear. Perhaps it depended on local population density, on the social value of surplus, or on the symbolic role of cereals in ritual feasting. The evidence of large communal structures like those at Jerf El Amar suggests that shared ceremonies may have demanded predictable food supplies, encouraging intentional sowing. Planetary scale observations remind us that the transition was never isolated. As the Fertile Crescent shifted toward cultivation, other parts of the world also began domesticating plants, rice in East Asia, millet in northern China, and tubers in New Guinea. These parallel pathways suggest that the conditions of the early Holocene warmer temperatures, more reliable rainfall, and expanding wetlands created global opportunities for human-plant entanglement. The Fertile Crescent stands out not because it was unique, but because cereals there had traits that lent themselves to domestication: large seeds, natural abundance, and growth in dense stands. Scale references highlight the magnitude of this transformation. A small scatter of seeds near a hearth might cover only a few square meters. But when repeated across dozens of villages over centuries, these patches cumulatively transformed landscapes stretching hundreds of kilometers. What began as the convenience of nearby grasses gradually became the foundation of regional subsistence. The physical labor of tending patches left marks on the body. Skeletal remains from Abu Huraira show changes in toes, knees, and lower backs, consistent with repetitive squatting, bending, and carrying heavy loads, while teeth reveal wear from grit in stone-ground flour. These bodily traces remind us that cultivation was not an abstract innovation but an embodied practice shaping muscles, joints, and health. The quieter evidence lies in pollen cores extracted from lake beds near settlements. Around the time domestication traits appear, pollen profiles shift to show rising proportions of cereal pollen compared with wild plants. This record reveals that human activity was altering plant communities on a landscape scale, replacing diversity with uniform stands of grasses. The first hints of anthropogenic ecosystems appear here, a transformation that will expand dramatically in the millennia to come. The story of seeds scattered by human hands is not one of sudden invention, but of slow realization. Families noticed patterns, retained favorable grains, tended patches, and learned from both failure and success. Whether by accident or by design, they brought plants into new rhythms of dependence. In doing so, they crossed an invisible boundary. The landscape itself changed character. Fields, however small, were no longer just wild meadows, but extensions of human habitation, mirrors of human memory and labor. Each germinated seed near a house wall testified that humans were no longer only gatherers of what nature provided, but participants in reshaping what would grow next season. This new relationship blurred lines between wild and domestic, between camp and field, between past and future. It is here, in the scattered seeds that sprout at the edge of settlements, that farming begins its long emergence. Alongside the tending of plants, humans begin to reshape their relationships with animals, moving gradually from hunting to herding. In the upland plateaus and valleys of the Fertile Crescent, wild herds of gazelles once provided the bulk of meat, hunted in coordinated drives that left mass kill sites littered with bones. Archaeological evidence from Natufian and pre-pottery Neolithic contexts shows the remains of thousands of gazelles, suggesting that communal hunting was not only subsistence, but also social practice. Yet as populations grew and habitats shifted, gazelle herds thinned and attention turned to other animals that lived closer to human settlements. The fact that grounds this section is the domestication of goats and sheep in the Zagros Mountains and nearby foothills, dated to around 10,500 years ago, through genetic and archaeological evidence. Bones show age and sex profiles consistent with human management. Young males slaughtered, early, breeding females kept longer patterns that distinguish herding from hunting. This marks the earliest clear evidence of managed livestock, setting a precedent for domestication across Eurasia. The lesser-known detail is that even before goats and sheep became primary domesticates, people experimented with gazelles. Evidence from desert sites in the Levant shows stone enclosures and drive walls designed to corral gazelles in mass hunts, an intermediate strategy between wild pursuit and controlled management. These structures, sometimes called kites, stretched across landscapes and channeled animals into confined spaces. While gazelles never became domesticated, the techniques of mass capture foreshadow the control later exercised over sheep and goats. The unresolved mystery is why goats and sheep succeeded where gazelles did not. Gazelles reproduce quickly and live in large herds, traits that might seem favorable for domestication. Yet their nervous temperament, long migratory ranges, and difficulty breeding in captivity may have made them unsuitable. Goats and sheep, in contrast, tolerate human presence, adapt to varied diets, and can be herded across rough terrain. Why humans first invested in these animals and whether this choice was conscious or circumstantial remains a subject of debate. On the planetary scale, the shift from hunting to herding reflects broader environmental pressures. As the Holocene climate stabilized, forests expanded in some regions, but arid zones also developed where rainfall diminished. In these drier areas, large migratory herds became less reliable, while smaller, more adaptable animals like goats thrived. Goats, in particular, excel at browsing shrubs and surviving in marginal environments, making them ideal companions for people who increasingly lived in fixed settlements with limited hunting ranges. The transformation from gazelle hunting to goat herding is visible in settlement remains. At early Neolithic sites like Sayonu and Ganj Dareh, goat bones dominate faunal assemblages. Cut marks show butchery practices while dung layers indicate corrals near houses. This proximity signals a new intimacy between humans and animals. Goats were not only food, but also part of the daily environment, bleating in enclosures, trampling soil, and leaving manure that fertilized nearby plots. The archaeological traces of corrals, compacted earth dung layers, post holes demonstrate that herding was embedded in the architecture of villages. A lesser-known line of evidence comes from isotopic studies of animal bones, which reveal controlled diets indicating that herders supplemented grazing with cut vegetation. This suggests deliberate care, blurring the line between wild foraging and managed feeding. Such practices mark the beginning of an enduring partnership. The transition to herding reshaped social rhythms. Hunting required bursts of communal effort, large gatherings and coordination across groups, while herding demanded daily repetitive labor milking, guarding leading animals, to browse repairing enclosures. These contrasting demands may have altered community structures, tying people more closely to their settlements and creating new roles within households. Some individuals specialized in animal care while others focused on crops or craft. This diversification reflects the broader Neolithic transformation of human societies. The unresolved question of why herding spread so rapidly may lie partly in its advantages over exclusive farming. Animals provided not only meat but also milk, hides, and wool, diversifying resources and reducing risks tied to crop failures. Goats and sheep also served as mobile wealth easily transported across landscapes, unlike grain stored in fixed pits. Their ability to convert inedible plants into usable food made them valuable in marginal zones where crops struggled. On a planetary level, the domestication of animals mirrored similar processes elsewhere. In East Asia, pigs and dogs became companions to farmers. In the Andes, llamas and alpacas filled this role. The timing differs, but the pattern is consistent. As humans settled, they sought to stabilize food supplies not only through cultivation, but through animal management. This dual strategy provided resilience against the uncertainties of climate and harvest. A scale reference emphasizes the magnitude of this shift. A herd of 50 goats could sustain a village of dozens, providing meat over months, milk daily, and hides seasonally. Compared with a single mass hunt that required vast coordination and yielded sudden abundance, followed by scarcity, herding spread resources across time, aligning with the new rhythms of sedentary life. The bones themselves tell the story of transition. In early levels of sites, gazelle remains dominate, often with age profiles reflecting mass kills. In later levels, goat bones appear with selective culling patterns, a clear signal of human decision-making. The change is not abrupt but gradual, as hunting continues alongside herding for generations. Yet over time, the balance tips and domesticated animals become central. Mystery lingers in the symbolic realm as well. At Çatalhöyük, later Neolithic wall paintings depict wild aurochs and other animals, not the domesticated species that filled the corrals. This suggests that even as herding transformed subsistence, wild animals retained symbolic power, perhaps embodying the untamed world that humans had partly left behind. The persistence of wild imagery alongside domestic practice reflects the tension between old and new modes of living. The planetary observation extends to the nitrogen cycle, altered by the presence of corrals. Dung concentrated near settlements enriched soils, unintentionally fertilizing the first cultivated fields. This byproduct of herding linked animals to crops in a feedback loop. Goats and sheep grazed on stubble and weeds, returned nutrients through manure, and thus sustained the very plots that supported their keepers. In this way, the integration of animals and plants created early agro-pastoral systems, complex interactions that stabilized human communities. The shift from gazelles to goats thus marks more than a dietary change. It signals a reorganization of landscapes, economies, and social worlds. Hunting drives across open plains give way to daily tending of herds in corrals. Abundance, measured in thousands of gazelle carcasses, transforms into continuity measured in generations of goat offspring. The soundscape changes to less. The thundering of fleeing herds, more the constant bleating at the edge of villages. These changes, once set in motion, shape the trajectory of human history. The move from wild prey to managed stock reflects the broader Neolithic pattern. Humans no longer live solely within ecosystems, but begin to design them, selecting which plants grow near their houses and which animals graze beside their fields. Farming is not only about seeds, it is also about herds. Together, they anchor humanity to new rhythms, creating the material and symbolic foundations of settled life. As cereals begin to grow in tended plots and goats and sheep settle into corrals, another change unfolds across the landscapes of the Fertile Crescent, the rise of villages on the river plains. What were once clusters of seasonal huts become permanent communities built in stone, mud brick, and timber, aligned along watercourses that provide steady supplies of fish, fertile alluvial soil, and transportation routes. The archaeological record demonstrates that by around 10,000 years ago, villages such as Jericho in the Jordan Valley and Sayonu in southeastern Anatolia had grown to several hectares with dozens of buildings arranged in planned layouts. This fact, firmly established through excavation anchors, the narrative farming and herding made permanent settlement possible, and settlement in turn reshaped human society. The lesser-known detail is that some of these earliest villages show evidence of communal architecture distinct from ordinary houses. At Jerf el Amar on the Euphrates, archaeologists uncovered circular subterranean structures interpreted as communal meeting places with benches built into the walls. These buildings suggest that social organization extended beyond the household, requiring spaces where decisions, ceremonies, and perhaps food distribution could occur. Such communal spaces signal the emergence of new social forms tied directly to the permanence of settlement. The unresolved mystery is what drew people into these dense communities in the first place. Sedentism brought advantages, security of food storage, shared labor, but it also created risks. Disease spreads more easily in close quarters. Waste accumulates, and dependence on local resources makes communities vulnerable to failure of harvests. Why then did people persist in building villages rather than returning to mobile foraging? Some scholars argue that ritual and social cohesion played decisive roles. The act of living together in enduring structures created shared identity that outweighed the costs. Others emphasize that the abundance of resources in river valleys simply made mobility unnecessary. The debate continues, for the archaeological traces show permanence but not intention. On the planetary scale, the rise of villages coincides with transformations in climate and hydrology. Around 10,000 years ago, global sea levels continued their steady rise. Rivers cut new courses through soft alluvium and monsoon systems stabilized. In the Near East, rainfall supported the spread of oak pistachio woodlands, and the rivers of the Tigris-Euphrates basin carried rich sediments from upland erosion, depositing them on floodplains. These natural processes created environments that favored both cultivation and settlement. Humans built their villages not against the grain of nature, but within its most fertile niches. At Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites on Earth, a massive stone tower and wall, were constructed around 9,000 years ago. This early fortification, rising several meters high, remains a remarkable feat of Neolithic engineering. Its purpose is debated: defense against floods, protection from human rivals, or symbolic demonstration of communal effort. But its presence shows that village life encouraged large-scale projects beyond individual households. The collective labor to move stones and build walls suggests new levels of social cooperation and planning. Within the houses of these villages, everyday life left subtle marks. Plastered floors at Çatalhöyük and other sites bear impressions of mats and furniture, showing how domestic spaces were organized for cooking, sleeping, and working. Grinding stones, hearths, and bins appear inside houses rather than in open communal areas, reflecting a shift toward household-centered production. Yet the presence of large ovens and storage pits in communal buildings indicates that food was still shared at the group level, balancing household autonomy with collective responsibility. A lesser-known detail comes from plastered skulls found in several early villages, including Jericho. Human skulls were modeled with plaster and decorated, then displayed within houses. These practices suggest an ancestral cult in which the dead were incorporated into the living community. Such rituals bound families to their homes and villages, reinforcing the permanence of settlement through memory and reverence. Mystery remains about how these early communities organized leadership and decision-making. No palaces or hierarchical structures appear in the earliest villages, yet communal architecture and large-scale projects imply coordination. Did elders lead councils? Did ritual specialists guide decisions? The absence of clear evidence leaves room for debate, reminding us that the origins of social complexity were gradual and multifaceted. On a planetary scale, these early villages can be seen as nodes in a growing web of human occupation. Their spread across the Fertile Crescent demonstrates that sedentary life was not confined to a single valley, but extended across thousands of kilometers, from the Levant through Mesopotamia and into Anatolia. The permanence of these communities contrasts with the mobility that defined humanity for tens of thousands of years, marking a turning point not only in subsistence, but in human relationship to land. Scale references emphasize the immensity of this change. A village like Jericho, covering 4 hectares, may have housed hundreds of people, a population density greater than most foraging camps by orders of magnitude. The concentration of people in one place for generations transformed both social life and ecology. Forests near villages were cut for timber fields expanded outward, and grazing animals reshaped vegetation. Villages altered landscapes in ways visible in pollen records, which show declines in woodland species and increases in grasses associated with human disturbance. Daily rhythms in villages differed from those of foraging bands. Instead of seasonal migrations, people now experience the repetition of tasks within fixed locations, sowing in spring, tending fields in summer, harvesting in autumn, and feeding animals through winter. Children grew up in the same houses where their parents lived, and burials beneath floors anchored lineages to specific structures. This continuity across generations was unprecedented in human history. A lesser-known archaeological insight comes from residue analysis on stone tools found in village contexts, which shows traces of multiple crops and plants, indicating that villagers cultivated not only cereals, but also legumes, fruits, and possibly flax for fibers. These findings suggest a diversified economy more complex than grain alone. The integration of crops, animals, and craft production within villages created new dependencies and opportunities. Mystery lingers in how conflict was managed in these close-knit communities. The presence of walls and towers at some sites suggests defense, but whether against floods, animals, or human rivals is unclear. Did neighboring villages compete for land and water, or did they cooperate through exchange networks? Archaeological evidence of obsidian trade from Anatolia to the Levant shows that long-distance connections flourished, suggesting that cooperation across regions balanced local tensions. On the planetary scale, these villages mark the first human landscapes recognizable as permanent settlements on a global map. From above, one would see dots of habitation stitched along rivers, clustered near springs, and scattered across plains. These dots represented a new kind of permanence, places where human presence endured across centuries, reshaping soils, vegetation, and animal populations. The rise of villages on river plains thus represents more than a demographic change. It signifies the beginning of rooted human communities where architecture, ritual, and subsistence merged into enduring ways of life. Villages created social memory, ecological transformation, and material culture that lasted beyond a single generation. In their permanence lay the foundations of cities, though the people of these early villages could not foresee what their towers, walls, and houses foreshadowed. They simply lived in new rhythms, bound to the rivers and plains that sustained them in settlements that would echo across human history. The rhythm of the early Holocene is not unbroken stability. Around 12 to 900 years ago, just as cereals and settlements were spreading across the Fertile Crescent climates, swung sharply back toward cold and aridity in what is known as the Younger Dryas. For more than a millennium, glaciers advanced again in northern latitudes. Rainfall diminished across Southwest Asia, and grasslands withered into desert scrub. Archaeological layers from sites such as Abu Huraira in the Euphrates Valley record this stress in stark ways. Wild plant species disappear from the charred seed remains. Gazelle numbers decline in the faunal record, and evidence of intensified cereal gathering appears. The fact that anchors this section is that the Younger Dryas represents one of the most abrupt climate reversals in the late Pleistocene, cooling the northern hemisphere by several degrees in just decades. It forced human communities to adapt rapidly, tightening their reliance on plants and animals that could withstand unpredictable conditions. A lesser-known detail is that during this period the inhabitants of Abu Huraira began cultivating rye, one of the earliest known cases of intentional cereal planting. Archaeobotanical studies showed domesticated traits in rye grains dating to the Younger Dryas, suggesting that climatic stress pushed people to experiment with cultivation when wild stands failed. Although rye did not remain the dominant cereal in the region, its early domestication reflects the role of necessity in innovation. The unresolved mystery is why some groups chose intensification, while others may have retreated or dispersed. In the face of cooling, some settlements persisted and deepened their experiments with cultivation, while others abandoned marginal lands. Archaeology records both resilience and collapse, but it does not always reveal the social decisions behind them. Did ritual and community cohesion encourage persistence in difficult places, or did pragmatic choices drive people to new territories? The answers remain uncertain, leaving open the question of how much cultural factors influenced adaptation. On the planetary scale, the Younger Dryas illustrates the volatility of the Earth's climate system. The abrupt cooling is thought to have been triggered by a massive outflow of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents and reducing heat transport. This event altered weather across hemispheres, drying the tropics and cooling Eurasia, while even Antarctica shows subtle signals of the shift. Human societies, newly semi-sedentary, were caught between mobility and permanence, forced to adjust in landscapes they were only beginning to anchor themselves to. Evidence of adaptation can be seen in changing toolkits. At sites in the Levant microliths, tiny stone blades become common, hafted into sickles, used for intensive harvesting of cereals. Gloss on these blades reveals that they were employed not for casual gathering, but for systematic cutting of stalks, suggesting increased labor invested in plant collection. Grinding stones proliferate, some weighing dozens of kilograms, too heavy to move easily, implying that people committed to place even under climatic stress. These changes point to intensified food production strategies born of necessity. A lesser-known clue lies in the remains of pulses, lentils, peas, and vetches found in early Neolithic sites. These legumes, tolerant of marginal soils and able to fix nitrogen, appear more frequently during the Younger Dryas, indicating that people diversified their diets in response to cereal shortages. This botanical detail reveals how resilience often depended on small adaptive choices rather than grand transformations. The mystery deepens when considering the social consequences of these pressures. Some scholars suggest that the stress of the Younger Dryas may have encouraged the construction of large ceremonial sites, such as Göbekli Tepe, where monumental stone enclosures and carved pillars rise around 11,600 years ago, just after the cold period ended. The scale of labor invested in these structures implies communal effort at a time when food production was precarious. Did hardship foster collective ritual as a means of cohesion, or did rituals demand surplus that drove agricultural innovation? The sequence of cause and effect remains unresolved, But the coincidence of climatic stress, intensification of food production, and the rise of monumental ritual architecture suggests a deep entanglement. Planetary observations remind us that these human responses were not isolated. Across the globe, other regions also show signs of climatic stress during the Younger Dryas. In North America, megafauna populations declined, perhaps exacerbated by hunting. In East Asia, monsoon systems weakened, altering rice habitats. The Fertile Crescent was not unique in facing disruption, but its communities responded by leaning further into plant cultivation, setting a trajectory that would reverberate long after the climate warmed again. A scale reference brings the severity of this period into focus in less than a human lifetime. Average temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere fell by several degrees greater than the difference between modern Cairo and Berlin. For communities bound to seasonal cycles of plants, such changes were dramatic. Harvests failed, animal migrations shifted, and water sources dried. To persist, people had to innovate. And those innovations, sowing rye, storing legumes, building grinding installations, became the foundation for later agriculture. At Abu Huraira, the bones of small game such as hares and birds increased during the Younger Dryas layers, evidence that people broadened their hunting spectrum as larger prey declined. This intensification of small resource use reflects a strategy known as broad-spectrum foraging, a response to scarcity. Yet layered atop this strategy are the first experiments in cultivation, showing that resilience required both expansion of foraging and narrowing of focus onto a few promising crops. Another lesser-known line of evidence comes from isotopic studies of human bones from early Holocene contexts, which show dietary shifts toward greater reliance on plants during and after the Younger Dryas. This confirms that the climate-driven experimentation with cereals had lasting impacts on human nutrition. Yet the mystery of motivation lingers. Did people perceive cultivation as a strategy to outlast the cold, or was it simply an extension of earlier habits amplified by necessity? The archaeological record preserves grains and tools, but not the thoughts that guided their use. On the planetary scale, the Younger Dryas ended as abruptly as it began. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures rose sharply, glaciers retreated for the final time, and the Holocene began in earnest. For the communities of the Fertile Crescent, this return to warmth validated their experiments. Seeds scattered in plots grew more predictably, herds of goats and sheep thrived in stable pastures, and rivers ran steadily. The adaptations forged in hardship became permanent practices in abundance. The story of climate stress and experimentation thus reflects a broader truth. Human societies rarely innovate in comfort. It is when conditions turn uncertain, when winters lengthen, harvests fail, and prey vanish, that new strategies emerge. The Younger Dryas forced humans to balance mobility with permanence, risk with security, wild gathering with cultivation. In doing so, it catalyzed the shift toward farming that would define the Holocene. The legacy of this period is visible not only in the genetic signatures of early rye and wheat, but also in the cultural memory of persistence. Villages that endured the cold carried forward practices of planting, storing, and tending, even when warmth returned. What began as emergency strategies hardened into traditions, and traditions became the framework of farming. The Younger Dryas thus stands as both interruption and catalyst, a millennium-long trial that nearly disrupted the trajectory of settlement, but instead solidified it. In the pattern of human history, moments of stress often mark the thresholds of transformation. And here, the cold years forged the skills and habits that would sustain humanity through the ages to come. When the Younger Dryas ends around 11,700 years ago, warmth returns with unusual stability, and the Fertile Crescent enters a new ecological phase. Rivers swell reliably, rainfall supports oak and pistachio woodlands, and grasses reassert themselves in valleys and uplands. Into this steadier climate, the first fields of grain take recognizable form. They are not yet vast expanses, but small, cultivated patches cleared by hand, scratched by digging sticks, and guarded from grazing animals. Archaeobotanical remains show that by 10,000 years ago, domesticated forms of wheat and barley, bearing non-shattering ears and larger grains, appear consistently across sites from the Levant to the Zagros. This fact anchors the section. Genetic and morphological evidence demonstrates that cereals had crossed the threshold into full domestication by the early Holocene, transforming landscapes once dominated by wild stands into human-tended fields. A lesser-known detail comes from the discovery of weed species alongside early cereal remains. Plants such as goosefoot and ryegrass thrive in disturbed soils and appear in abundance in Neolithic layers. Their presence indicates that people were not only harvesting cereals, but actively disturbing land in ways that created new ecological niches. These weeds are silent witnesses to cultivation emerging only when soil is regularly tilled, trampled, or seeded. The unresolved mystery is why cereals became the primary domesticated plants even though many other species were available. Fruits, nuts, and legumes were part of the diet, yet it was wheat and barley that anchored early agriculture. Some scholars argue that cereals offered caloric density and storability unmatched by other foods. Others note that their growth cycle fit well with seasonal rhythms. Yet the symbolic or cultural weight of grain may also have played a role, as later rituals consistently centered on cereals. The balance of practical and cultural factors remains debated. On the planetary scale, the spread of cultivated cereals marked a profound shift in ecosystems. Pollen cores from lakes near early villages show sudden rises in cereal pollen, a clear signal that human activity reshaped plant communities over wide areas. This transformation coincided with the Holocene's stable climate regime, which provided the long growing seasons needed for domesticated cereals to thrive. As glaciers retreated and sea levels rose, fertile alluvial soils accumulated in valleys, offering ground that responded well to repeated cultivation. Human labor and planetary stability converged to make farming viable. In the Euphrates Valley, sites such as Meribit and Abu Huraira preserve sequences that illustrate the emergence of fields. Layers of charred seeds show increasing proportions of domesticated cereals, while grinding tools multiply in size and number. In later levels, storage facilities become more elaborate, suggesting that cultivation had moved beyond experiment into reliance. Houses are rebuilt with larger plastered floors, storage bins embedded in their walls, and outdoor workspaces where chaff and straw accumulated. The landscape outside these villages must have been dotted with clearings where grain grew in patches clustered close enough to the settlement for daily tending. A lesser-known piece of evidence comes from impressions of woven baskets in clay floors, showing that harvested grain was carried and stored in perishable containers long before pottery emerged. These baskets, though gone, left their marks as negative space in hardened clay, silent proof of how people managed the new surpluses. The mystery of scale remains. How large were the first fields? Estimates based on household consumption suggest that a family needed only a few hectares to supply its grain, yet the presence of communal storage and feasting implies production beyond subsistence. Were fields coordinated collectively, or did each household maintain its own? The lack of boundaries in the archaeological record leaves the question unresolved. Planetary processes continued to shape possibilities. The rivers of Mesopotamia deposited fresh silt each year, enriching soils, but also requiring strategies to avoid floods. In upland Anatolia, rainfall supported dry farming without irrigation. But in drier zones, crops depended on careful timing and storage. Human adaptation to these varied conditions explains why farming did not spread uniformly, but developed in clusters where landwater and labor converged. A scale reference highlights the magnitude of change. A single hectare of cultivated wheat could yield enough grain to feed a family of 5 for a year, an efficiency far surpassing foraging. With even modest increases in cultivated area, villages could support larger populations than ever before. This caloric surplus underpinned demographic growth visible in archaeological records as settlements expanded from a few dozen people to several hundred. Within houses, the signs of grain-based life multiplied. Grinding stones became heavier and more permanent, suggesting daily labor devoted to flour. Hearths shifted from open fires to enclosed ovens capable of baking bread or cooking porridge. Ash layers mixed with chaff and straw reveal that agricultural byproducts were burned as fuel, recycling the waste of fields into heat. These subtle traces, charred seeds, oven floors, grinding grooves, collectively testify to a new subsistence regime. A lesser-known botanical insight comes from phytoliths in dung deposits, showing that cereal straw was used as fodder for animals. This integration of plants and livestock created closed loops. Goats grazed on stubble. Their manure fertilized fields, and grain fed both humans and animals. Farming was never just about crops, but about managing whole ecosystems in miniature. Mystery endures about the social consequences of these fields. Did surplus lead to inequality as some households controlled more grain than others, or did early communities distribute harvests collectively through feasting and storage? The evidence of large communal buildings alongside household bins suggests a balance, but the dynamics remain debated. What is clear is that farming changed time itself. Harvest cycles dictated calendars, anchoring communities to seasonal labor that repeated predictably. The wandering rhythm of foragers gave way to the measured pulse of sowing, weeding, and reaping. Planetary-scale reflections remind us that such transformations were not confined to the Fertile Crescent. Around the same time, rice cultivation began in East Asia, millet in northern China, and tuber cultivation in New Guinea. The synchronous emergence of farming across continents underscores the global significance of Holocene stability. Yet in the Fertile Crescent, wheat and barley became the keystone crops, their fields forming the backbone of one of the world's first agricultural systems. By the close of this period, landscapes once wild had been remade into mosaics of fields, pastures, and villages. Human presence was no longer ephemeral, but inscribed into soil, pollen, and stone. The first fields of grain stand as a threshold in prehistory. They mark the moment when human survival depended not on what could be found, but on what could be grown. The soil itself became an archive of memory, storing seeds that sprouted not only food, but a new way of living, binding communities to land in ways that would endure for millennia. As fields of grain spread outward from villages, the tools of daily life changed to meet the demands of cultivation, and with them, the meals and tastes of communities. Grinding stones and hearth smoke became defining features of Neolithic households, and their presence in archaeological layers tells us much about the shift in human diets. The fact that anchors this section is the widespread appearance of heavy groundstone tools in early farming settlements. Mortars, pestles, saddle querns, and later rotary querns appear in large numbers, often too heavy to move easily, signaling the permanence of food processing within homes. These stones, some weighing over 30 kilograms, are found across the Fertile Crescent by 10,000 years ago, and their polish and grooves bear the imprint of generations of use. They show that grain was no longer a seasonal supplement, but a staple requiring daily labor. A lesser-known detail lies in the micro-remains preserved on these tools. Starch grains and phytoliths extracted from the surfaces of querns reveal a wide variety of plants, processed barley and wheat, of course, but also legumes, nuts, and even wild grasses that continued to supplement diets. Residues also show that some cereals were ground when still green, then parched and stored, extending the harvest season. These details highlight how flexible early food systems were, weaving old foraging habits into the new framework of farming. The unresolved mystery is how quickly bread and porridge became central to daily meals. Baking ovens and cooking installations appear in villages such as Çatalhöyük, but whether these foods were staples from the start or luxuries for special occasions remains debated. Experimental archaeology shows that flatbreads can be made easily on hot stones, while boiling cracked grain into porridge requires containers able to withstand heat, such as stone bowls or early pottery. Yet the relative importance of these forms, bread, porridge, or roasted grain, cannot be firmly established from the archaeological record. What is clear is that fire and stone transformed grain into digestible, storable, and versatile meals. On the planetary scale, this shift in diet reflects broader changes in human biology. Studies of dental remains show increased wear from stone grit that entered flour during grinding. Microscopic scratches on teeth from Neolithic skeletons reveal the daily consumption of abrasive foods, while skeletal changes in knees, backs, and shoulders indicate the repetitive labor of grinding. At the same time, genetic evidence suggests that human populations adapted to starch-rich diets with copy numbers of amylase genes increasing in farming groups. These biological signatures reveal that the adoption of grain-based foods reshaped not only culture, but also bodies. The interiors of Neolithic houses preserve the atmosphere of this transformation. Hearths, often central in single-room dwellings, carry layers of ash mixed with charred seeds. Some ovens were built into walls, their clay linings hardened by fire, suggesting specialized spaces for baking. In communal areas, large ovens point to shared meals where bread or roasted grain may have been prepared for feasts. The smoke of hearths darkened plastered walls, leaving residues that endure to this day. A lesser-known find comes from residues of bitumen-lined baskets used for storing flour. These waterproofed containers, discovered in sites along the Euphrates, reveal an innovation that extended the life of ground grain and protected it from moisture. Such practices demonstrate that communities not only produced, but also carefully preserved their food. Mystery lingers over the symbolic role of grain preparation. Some grinding stones were placed in burials, suggesting that the act of processing food had meaning beyond subsistence. Were these tools status symbols, gifts to the dead, or reminders of daily labor? The answer is unclear, but their inclusion in graves shows that food preparation was central to identity. On the planetary scale, the smoke of countless hearths marked a new ecological footprint. Where once fires had been lit at temporary campsites, now they burned daily in fixed locations, consuming wood from nearby forests. Charcoal studies reveal that woodlands near villages declined, replaced by secondary growth better adapted to repeated cutting. Firewood collection thus reshaped ecosystems, and the haze of hearth smoke became a constant feature of settled life. Scale references underscore the magnitude of this change. A family of 5 might consume several hundred kilograms of grain in a year, requiring hours of grinding each day. Across a village of several hundred people, this meant tons of grain processed annually and thousands of hours of labor devoted to turning seeds into flour. The rhythm of grinding and baking became as central to Neolithic life as hunting had been to their ancestors. The meals that resulted also transformed social life. Bread and porridge could be shared, divided, and stored, creating opportunities for feasting and exchange. Unlike meat, which spoiled quickly, flour and bread lasted, allowing surpluses to accumulate and be redistributed. Archaeological evidence of large communal feasts, such as those inferred from mass animal bones at Göbekli Tepe and other sites, suggests that grain-based foods played a role in binding communities together. A lesser-known insight comes from lipid residues in early pottery, showing traces of both cereals and animal fats. These residues suggest that porridges or stews combining grain and meat were cooked, blending plant and animal products in new ways. Such culinary practices underscore the integration of farming and herding economies. The unresolved question of health also arises. Skeletal remains show that farming populations, despite their caloric security, often suffered from nutritional deficiencies. Evidence of anemia, stunted growth, and dental cavities increases in Neolithic cemeteries compared with earlier hunter-gatherer groups. Why did people persist with farming diets despite these challenges? The answer may lie in reliability. Even if grain-based diets were less diverse, they offered security in numbers and predictability in harvests. On the planetary scale, the cultivation and processing of grain marked humanity's entry into a new metabolic relationship with the earth. Fields captured solar energy in concentrated forms, and grinding stones released it into human bodies. This energy supported larger populations, denser settlements, and the surplus required for ritual and innovation. Humanity's partnership with cereals thus represented a new phase in the long story of energy use. The atmosphere of early villages can almost be reconstructed through these traces: the sound of querns grinding, the sight of smoke curling from ovens, the smell of roasting grain, the taste of bread baked from the first domesticated wheat. These sensory details, though lost to time, can be glimpsed in charred seeds, worn stones, and smoke-darkened walls. They speak of a daily life defined by repetition, labor, and sustenance. The grinding stones and hearth smoke of the Neolithic were not just tools and byproducts. They were the pulse of settled life, anchoring communities to rhythms of food preparation that persisted for millennia. Farming was not only about planting seeds in fields, but also about transforming those seeds into meals, and in that transformation lay the sustenance of villages, the stability of populations, and the foundation of future civilizations. With grain ground into flour and baked into bread, the question of time becomes central, for food no longer needs to be eaten immediately. The silent work of storage reshapes human life as profoundly as cultivation itself. Archaeological excavations across the Fertile Crescent reveal subterranean silos, clay-lined pits, and later ceramic vessels designed to hold surplus cereals, pulses, and dried fruits. The fact anchoring this section is clear by the pre-pottery Neolithic B, around 900 and 500 years ago. Storage facilities are standard features of settlements from Jericho to Çatalhöyük, showing that the ability to preserve food across seasons had become a cornerstone of survival. Surplus turns ephemeral abundance into security and creates new relationships with both landscape and time. A lesser-known detail lies in the construction of some storage bins. At sites like Dra in Jordan, archaeologists found round mud-plastered silos, predating full domestication of cereals. Built around 11,000 years ago, these silos contained wild barley and wheat, suggesting that storage preceded intensive farming. People gathered wild harvests and guarded them against pests and rot, indicating that the idea of preservation was already embedded in semi-sedentary life before true agriculture crystallized. The unresolved mystery concerns control. Who owned the surplus once it was sealed in pits or jars? Did households guard their own stores, or were resources pooled and redistributed at the communal level? The archaeological record provides hints. Storage bins inside houses suggest private ownership, while larger communal silos indicate collective strategies. But the balance between household autonomy and community sharing remains debated. On the planetary scale, the innovation of storage reflects a deeper pattern of human adaptation, the manipulation of ecological rhythms to stretch across time. In the Pleistocene, survival depended on mobility, tracking resources as they appeared and vanished. In the Holocene, storage allowed people to anchor themselves, to place buffering against seasonal scarcity and climatic variability. This manipulation of time paralleled planetary processes as glaciers stored water for millennia and oceans stored heat. Humans mirrored these rhythms on smaller scales, with their own caches of energy preserved for future use. Within villages, storage shaped architecture. In Çatalhöyük, bins were built into house walls, plastered smooth and sometimes sealed with clay. At Jericho, silos rose above ground, their thick walls insulating against heat and pests. Storage pits, carefully dug and sometimes lined with stone, appear beneath floors and courtyards. These installations required planning, maintenance, and vigilance, embedding the act of preservation into daily routines. A lesser-known detail comes from charred rodent remains found inside storage contexts. These small intruders left their bones behind when caught or trapped, evidence of the constant struggle to defend grain from competitors. Humans, in domesticating plants, inadvertently created niches for pests, mice, rats, and insects that evolved alongside stored food. The silent work of storage thus brought new ecological relationships, binding humans not only to crops but also to the creatures that fed upon them. The mystery of how storage changed social dynamics extends into ritual contexts. At some sites, storage facilities are found adjacent to shrines or communal buildings, suggesting that grain reserves were tied to ceremony. Was surplus offered to ancestors, gods, or spirits as thanks for fertility? Were rituals enacted to protect stored food? The archaeological record cannot fully answer, but the proximity of grain and ritual spaces hints that storage carried symbolic as well as practical weight. On a planetary scale, pollen cores and sediment studies reveal that stored surplus encouraged larger populations to persist in one place, accelerating deforestation, soil disturbance, and landscape modification. The act of holding food across seasons reduced the risks of scarcity, but also increased the pressure to expand cultivation. As storage expanded, so too did the human footprint on Earth's ecosystems. Scale references emphasize the power of preservation. A single silo holding a cubic meter of grain, roughly 800 kilograms, could feed a family for months. Dozens of such silos in a village represented security against failed harvests, drought, or winter scarcity. Yet they also represented vulnerability. If pests, fire, or raiders destroyed stores, the community's survival was threatened. The concentration of food in fixed locations both strengthened and endangered settlements. A lesser-known line of evidence comes from phytolith analysis of storage sediments, which reveals not only cereals, but also legumes and sometimes fruits, showing that people stored a diverse range of foods. Lentils and peas in particular appear in storage pits, supplementing the protein-poor grain diet. This diversification highlights the sophistication of early farming economies. Mystery persists about the social consequences of surplus. Did storage allow some households to accumulate more than others, sowing the seeds of inequality? Or did collective sharing prevent disparity in the earliest villages? Archaeologists debate whether the rise of hierarchy is visible in storage evidence or only later in larger proto-urban sites. What is certain is that storage changed. The logic of subsistence food could now be possessed, guarded, and measured. On the planetary scale, the innovation of storage mirrors patterns in other early farming regions. In the Nile Valley, granaries became central to settlement life. In East Asia, storage pits preserved millet and rice. In Mesoamerica, maize was dried and held in woven baskets. Across continents, farming societies independently solved the problem of time through storage, a convergence that underscores its necessity. Within households, the atmosphere of storage was tangible. The cool, dark interior of a plastered bin held the smell of grain. The scraping sound of hands or tools retrieving seed marked daily meals. The anxiety of checking for rot or pests must have been constant. Storage turned food into something both present and absent, visible only when bins were opened, yet always in the background as a measure of security. A lesser-known discovery from sites in Anatolia shows impressions of woven lids or mats used to cover storage pits, preserving contents against air and insects. These fragile traces remind us that storage was not a single invention, but a suite of techniques: plastering, sealing, covering, monitoring, and repairing. Mystery remains about how storage intersected with gender and labor, who maintained bins, guarded supplies, or decided when to open reserves. These questions are rarely visible in material remains, but would have been central to daily life. The planetary consequence of storage reaches into demography. With reliable reserves, populations expanded, settlements grew denser, and mobility declined further. Archaeological surveys show settlement densities increasing across the Fertile Crescent after storage became widespread, indicating that preservation underpinned demographic growth. This growth, in turn, demanded more cultivation, creating feedback loops between surplus population and land use. The silent work of storage thus emerges as a hinge in prehistory. It made farming viable, settlement permanent, and populations larger. It also created vulnerabilities to pests, inequality, and conflict. Yet above all, it transformed human experience of time. Where once survival hinged on daily gathering and seasonal migration, now it hinged on the slow depletion of bins, the measured release of surplus, and the hope of replenishment at the next harvest. In those dark silos and plastered pits lay not only food, but the future preserved in seeds that bridged the gap between past abundance and future need. As food becomes more than a matter of daily survival, new meanings attach themselves to grain harvest and storage. In early farming villages, rituals appear among the harvest, linking the cycles of cultivation to cycles of belief. Archaeological discoveries across the Fertile Crescent show that shrines, figurines, and decorated buildings rise alongside storage pits and fields. The fact anchoring this section is that ritual architecture emerges in the Neolithic at the same time as farming. At sites like Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, monumental stone enclosures with carved animals were built around 11,600 years ago, predating or coinciding with the consolidation of agriculture. The timing suggests that ritual and subsistence were intertwined rather than separate domains. A lesser-known detail lies in the plastered skulls discovered at Jericho and other villages. Human skulls were removed, modeled with plaster, and painted, then displayed within houses or shrines. These practices, dating to around 9,000 years ago, suggest that ancestors were honored and made present within the living community. The placement of such skulls near storage and hearths hints that food and memory were linked with the harvest, feeding both bodies and spirits. The unresolved mystery is why monumental ritual spaces like Göbekli Tepe arose before permanent farming villages reached their peak. Some scholars argue that the need to gather large groups for construction and ceremony drove demand for surplus food, pushing cultivation forward. Others contend that farming preceded ritual and surpluses enabled labor for monument building. The sequence of cause and effect is debated, leaving open the question of whether belief spurred farming or farming spurred belief. On the planetary scale, rituals among the harvest mirror broader human responses to environmental uncertainty. Just as glaciers melted and sea levels rose, human communities sought stability in symbolic systems, embedding meaning into cycles of growth and decay. Rituals anchored people not only to land, but also to cosmologies that made sense of change. The earth itself, turning through seasons, became a framework for ceremony. Within villages, evidence of ritual is inscribed in architecture. At Çatalhöyük, wall paintings depict aurochs, deer, and human figures, often in association with food preparation spaces. Bullhorns, embedded in plastered walls, suggest symbolic links between animals and fertility. These decorative and architectural features coexisted with bins of grain and grinding stones, showing that daily labor and symbolic expression shared the same spaces. A lesser-known example comes from Nevrolochori, where a communal building contained benches and carved pillars interpreted as a shrine. Within it were figurines of humans and animals, some possibly linked to fertility or seasonal cycles. Such finds show that ritual was not peripheral but central to village life, woven into the architecture of early communities. Mystery persists about the nature of the rituals themselves. Were they dedicated to ancestors, fertility deities, or forces of nature? Without written records, Interpretations rest on material traces, carvings of animals, arrangements of human remains, layers of feasting debris. Some archaeologists suggest that seasonal gatherings at ritual sites structured the agricultural calendar, turning harvest into both subsistence and sacred duty. On the planetary scale, such rituals parallel developments in other parts of the world. In the Nile Valley, early farming groups built shrines associated with river cycles. In East Asia, ritual pits contain animal offerings linked to rice cultivation. The convergence suggests that wherever farming emerged, rituals arose to frame and sanctify it. Food became more than energy. It became a medium of connection between humans' ancestors and the cosmos. A scale reference emphasizes the communal dimension. At Göbekli Tepe, stones weighing several tons were quarried, shaped, and erected by groups of hundreds, requiring coordination beyond the household. Feasting debris of gazelle bones and wild cereals suggests that large gatherings occurred sustained by shared meals. These feasts demanded surpluses, reinforcing the cycle of cultivation and ritual. Food thus became a social glue binding communities through shared labor and shared ceremony. Within houses, smaller rituals coexisted with grand monuments. Figurines of women animals and hybrid forms appear in domestic contexts, often near hearths or storage bins. Some are deliberately broken, perhaps as offerings. These small objects suggest that ritual infused daily life, not just public gatherings. A lesser-known clue lies in the deposition of grain in burials. At some sites, charred seeds were placed with the dead, symbolic nourishment for journeys beyond life. Such practices underscore how deeply grain had entered the symbolic sphere. Mystery deepens when considering the gendered aspects of ritual. Figurines of women, often interpreted as fertility symbols, raise questions about the role of women in early farming communities. Were these images reflections of social reality, symbolic abstractions, or something else entirely? The debate endures, reminding us that symbolism is rarely straightforward. On the planetary scale, rituals among the harvest signal the beginning of humanity's long entanglement of belief and subsistence. Farming communities needed not only calories but meaning, and they found it in ceremonies that wove together plants, animals, ancestors, and landscapes. The rhythms of sowing and reaping mirrored cosmic cycles, embedding human labor into a larger order. Feasting played a central role in these rituals. Archaeological deposits at Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük, and other sites show concentrations of animal bones, burned seeds, and large vessels, evidence of collective meals. Such feasts were not only celebrations but opportunities for redistribution, cementing alliances and reinforcing social bonds. The consumption of stored surplus in ritual contexts demonstrates that farming was not purely utilitarian. It was also performative, a way of making visible the abundance of the community. A lesser-known detail comes from residues of fermented beverages found in stone vessels at Göbekli Tepe. Traces of barley-based beer suggest that grain was transformed not only into bread and porridge, but also into drink consumed in ritual feasts. This innovation highlights the cultural flexibility of cereals, capable of nourishing bodies, shaping ceremonies, and altering consciousness. Mystery lingers in the relationship between ritual and hierarchy. Did ritual specialists emerge controlling ceremonies and thereby gaining influence? Or were rituals shared more broadly among community members? The monumental scale of some sites suggests leadership, but the absence of palaces or clear elite residences complicates the picture. The early Neolithic remains ambiguous, poised between egalitarian cooperation and emerging inequality. On the planetary scale, the link between ritual and harvest resonates with later civilizations. From Egyptian temples to Mesopotamian ziggurats, agricultural cycles became enshrined in religion. The seeds of these traditions lie in the Neolithic, when rituals first rose among the harvest. By embedding food in ceremony, humans made farming not only a material practice but a cultural and spiritual one. The rituals of the early Neolithic show that farming was never just about calories. It was about meaning, memory, and belonging. Grain grew in fields, was stored in bins, baked in ovens, and consumed in feasts, but it also fed ancestors, spirits, and gods. The silent cycles of sowing and reaping became audible in chants, visible in carvings, and embodied in monuments. The harvest was more than subsistence. It was a bridge between the human and the sacred, a rhythm of life that carried both body and belief. From its heartlands in the Fertile Crescent, farming did not remain confined. Over generations, cultivated plants, herded animals, and settled lifeways spread outward, carried by migration, exchange, and imitation. The fact anchoring this section is clear. Archaeobotanical and genetic evidence shows that domesticated wheat, barley, sheep, and goats left their original regions and appeared in the Nile Valley, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Indus by the 8th and 7th millennia BCE. Farming was never a single invention, but a process that radiated across landscapes, adapting to diverse ecologies. A lesser-known detail comes from the island of Cyprus. Colonists carried domesticated animals there by boat as early as 10,500 years ago, introducing sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle to an island where none had existed. Archaeological sites such as Chilurokambos preserve the remains of these transported herds, evidence that farming societies possessed both the technological and organizational capacity to relocate entire subsistence systems across sea passages. This maritime spread underscores how deliberate and mobile early farmers could be. The unresolved mystery is whether farming spread primarily through the movement of people or the movement of ideas. In some regions, genetic studies of ancient human remains suggest that farmers migrated and settled new lands, bringing their crops and herds with them. In others, forager groups appear to have adopted cultivation through contact and exchange, without major population replacement. The balance between migration and adoption remains debated, and the pathways varied across regions. On the planetary scale, the spread of farming coincides with a wider reorganization of human presence. As the Holocene climate stabilized, deserts briefly retreated, rivers flowed predictably, and coastlines invited settlement. These environmental openings allowed farming to move along ecological corridors. River valleys, coastlines, and upland plateaus where rainfall and soil favored cultivation. The expansion of agriculture thus reflects both human agency and planetary opportunity. In Anatolia, sites such as Çatalhöyük show that farming villages grew rapidly, integrating crops and herds with elaborate ritual practices. Mud brick houses packed closely together reveal dense populations, while wall paintings and figurines suggest rich symbolic lives. Farther west, agriculture entered Europe by 8,000 years ago, following two main routes, one along the Mediterranean coast, the other through the Balkans and Danube basin. Each carried not only wheat and barley, but also pulses, livestock, and architectural traditions. The presence of early Neolithic pottery in these regions reveals that farming arrived as a package of practices reshaping subsistence and settlement. A lesser-known detail is the spread of obsidian alongside farming. Volcanic glass from central Anatolia is found in sites across the Levant and beyond, showing that long-distance trade networks accompanied the expansion of agriculture. Farmers not only carried seeds and animals, but also connected into broader systems of exchange, moving materials and ideas across hundreds of kilometers. The mystery of speed arises here. In some regions, farming spread rapidly, transforming landscapes within centuries. In others, foragers persisted alongside farmers for millennia, maintaining distinct traditions. Archaeologists debate why adoption varied. Did ecological conditions limit crops, or did cultural choices resist farming? The patchwork of evidence shows that farming was not an inevitable tide, but a mosaic of interactions. On the planetary scale, the spread of agriculture marks a turning point in human demography. Farming supported higher population densities than foraging, enabling villages to grow into towns and eventually cities. Genetic studies reveal population expansions in the early Holocene consistent with the surpluses generated by agriculture. These demographic changes reshaped the human map, concentrating people in fertile corridors while leaving marginal zones sparsely inhabited. Scale references bring the magnitude into perspective. From the Fertile Crescent to the Nile Valley is more than 600 kilometers, a journey of weeks on foot. Yet, within a few centuries, domesticated wheat and barley appear in Egyptian contexts, carried across deserts and through oases. From the Levant to Cyprus is a sea crossing of more than 70 kilometers, yet farmers transported entire herds. These distances illustrate the determination and capability of early agriculturalists to transplant their way of life. Within the Nile Valley, farming adapted to river cycles. Seasonal floods deposited fertile silt, allowing cereals to thrive. Here, agriculture merged with ancient riverine traditions, setting the stage for one of the world's earliest civilizations. In the Indus Valley, barley and wheat appeared alongside local domesticates, creating a blended agricultural system. These adaptations show that farming was not a rigid package, but a flexible set of practices reshaped by local environments. A lesser-known insight comes from isotopic studies of ancient livestock teeth, which reveal seasonal movement patterns. Early herders practiced transhumance, moving animals between lowland fields and upland pastures. This mobility shows that even as people built permanent villages, they maintained flexible strategies for managing herds across varied landscapes. Mystery remains about the role of seafaring in the spread of farming. Cyprus shows deliberate transport of animals, but how extensive was maritime colonization in the early Holocene? Did small boats carry seeds and livestock across the Aegean into Europe, or did farming move overland? First, archaeological traces are sparse, and the role of the sea in early farming dispersals remains an active area of research. On the planetary scale, the spread of farming created new ecological footprints. Forests were cleared in Europe, wetlands drained in the Nile Valley, and soils plowed in Anatolia. Charcoal records reveal increased burning associated with land clearance, while pollen profiles shift from woodland species to grasses and weeds. The ecological consequences of farming radiated outward with its spread, altering landscapes across continents. The atmosphere of these early farming frontiers must have been marked by both continuity and change. Foragers and farmers lived side by side, trading, intermarrying, and sometimes competing. In some areas, hybrid economies persisted, with people cultivating small plots while continuing to hunt fish and gather. Farming did not erase earlier traditions, but wove itself into them, creating diverse strategies across regions. A lesser-known discovery from sites in southeastern Europe shows that early farmers sometimes adopted local wild crops alongside imported cereals, blending traditions into unique regional agricultures. This flexibility illustrates how farming adapted rather than simply replaced. Mystery endures about how knowledge moved. Did farmers actively teach foragers how to sow and harvest, or did foragers observe and adopt practices independently? Did seeds change hands as gifts, trade items, or tokens in marriage exchanges? The mechanisms of transmission are rarely visible in archaeology, leaving gaps in the story of how farming knowledge spread. On the planetary scale, the outward movement of agriculture mirrors other contemporaneous shifts. In East Asia,